Have you noticed? The more desperately you try to control life, the more violently it seems to slip through your fingers. You control people and you lose them. You control time and you panic. You control your image and you forget who you are. You control the future and you can no longer live in the present. And at some point, after years of fighting, a question arises that almost no one has the courage to utter. What if the problem isn't that you aren't controlling enough, but that you are taught to live as a control mechanism? We call this power, but perhaps power, as we know it, is just a sophisticated form of fear. Because the person who controls obsessively is not free. They are a system constantly on high alert. And biology knows this. The human brain was not built for continuous hyper-control. When you live in a constant state of internal surveillance, verifying, anticipating, manipulating outcomes, trying to manage every reaction of the world, the nervous system enters a state of massive energy consumption. Cortisol spikes. The amygdala remains hyperactive. The body enters survival mode. And then the paradox appears. The more you try to control reality, the more threatening reality begins to seem. Not because the world has changed, but because your organism has begun to interpret existence as a battlefield. This is where the real story begins. Because there is a rare moment in some people's lives when something breaks. Not out of weakness, out of exhaustion. A moment when they can no longer continue the war. They can no longer control love. They can no longer control time. They can no longer control their image. They can no longer control the future. They can no longer control death. They can no longer control loss. And then, for the first time, they lay their weapons down. And what they discover next is perhaps the most unsettling truth of human consciousness. After the disappearance of control, chaos does not emerge. Coherence does. Science calls this phenomenon self-organization. In nature, the most stable systems are not those aggressively controlled from the outside, but those that spontaneously find their internal balance. Your heart is a perfect example. Millions of cardiac cells synchronize without a central dictator commanding their every move. They naturally enter a state of rhythmic coordination. Flocks of birds work the same way. Neural networks, healthy ecosystems, even certain human communities. Deep order does not always emerge through control. Sometimes it emerges through coherence. And this completely changes the definition of power. Perhaps true human evolution does not mean becoming more dominant. Perhaps it means becoming integrated enough inside so that we no longer need dominance. Think of the people who have influenced you most deeply in life. They probably weren't the ones who shouted the loudest, not the ones who obsessively tried to convince you, not the ones who constantly displayed their status, but the people who carried a certain inexplicable stillness, a presence that shifted the atmosphere of a room without effort. Neuroscience is beginning to understand why. Human nervous systems are deeply relational. Our brains emotionally and physiologically synchronize with the states of those around us through automatic mechanisms of interpersonal regulation. A deeply anxious person can destabilize an entire group. But the reverse is also true. A coherent nervous system can reduce collective stress without saying a word. This is the form of influence almost no one talks about. Influence without aggression. Influence without a show. Influence without dominance. The most powerful people are not always those who occupy the center. Sometimes they are the ones who no longer need a center. Because true stability does not come from external control. It comes from the reduction of internal conflict. And here lies an uncomfortable idea. Perhaps most of modern suffering does not come from a lack of power, but from the addiction to power, the addiction to validation, the addiction to image, the addiction to control, the addiction to superiority, the addiction to certainty. We live in a civilization that confuses tension with performance. We are taught that we must constantly force reality, force success, force relationships, force visibility, force identity. But any system forced too much begins to fracture. Psychologically, biologically, socially. Burnout is not just fatigue. It is the collapse of an architecture based on permanent control. The body says, I can no longer sustain this fight. And perhaps that is exactly where the transformation begins. Because the person who no longer has the energy to dominate sometimes begins to notice something incredible. Life flows even without the violence of control. The healing of a wound does not need to be consciously controlled. Authentic love cannot be forced. Sleep cannot be conquered. The deepest processes of existence appear precisely when we stop assaulting them. This is the paradox. The only battle you truly win is the one you surrender to. But beware, giving up control does not mean passivity. It does not mean a lack of boundaries. It does not mean accepting abuse or chaos. It means something much harder: to stop building your identity on permanent warfare. Because many people no longer know who they are without conflict. They have been in survival mode for so long that peace feels dangerous to them. That is why some destroy stable relationships. That is why some create chaos when everything is going well. That is why some confuse love with adrenaline. A nervous system addicted to the fight ends up feeling alive only in tension. Perhaps humanity is not just going through an economic or technological crisis. Perhaps it is going through a crisis of coherence. We have more information than ever, but less internal integration. More connectivity, but less emotional regulation. More performance, but less biological peace. And then the fundamental question arises: what happens to a civilization that develops its technology faster than its consciousness? History offers a brutal answer. Any power without coherence becomes self-destructive. At the individual level, at the political level, at the collective level. That is why perhaps the next real stage of human evolution is not artificial intelligence, but inner maturity. The capacity to exist without a permanent need for dominance. The capacity to influence without controlling. The capacity to remain stable without turning the world into an enemy. And here lies the greatest dilemma. Is this state humanity's natural next step, or is it just a brief illusion? Because in moments of panic, people tend to instinctively return to primitive forms of control. Fear reactivates centralization. It activates aggressiveness. It activates the need for authoritarian leaders. It activates tribalism. Perhaps post-power is not a permanent destination. Perhaps it is a fragile oscillation between two states, fear and coherence. And the future of the human species might depend exactly on this invisible choice. Not the choice between left and right. Not the choice between success and failure, but the choice between control and integration, between force and coherence, between dominance and presence. Because in the end, after all the noise of the world, after all the battles for status, image, and power, only one real question remains. How much energy do you waste trying to control what would bloom on its own if you just stopped resisting it? Perhaps true evolution begins exactly where the ego stops ruling everything like a besieged empire. Perhaps true strength only appears when you no longer need to prove you are strong. And perhaps this is the hardest thing a human being has to do: to stop turning life into a permanent battle against himself.